In an effort to avoid talking about Epstein, we got the Iran war. And now, in an effort to avoid talking about the Iran war, they're trying to get us angry at Anthony Fauci. I'll break down both for you today, and then I'll be joined by the unique Democratic candidate for the surprisingly competitive U.S. Senate race in Kansas. Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who vote for progress and want to convince their friends and family members to join our majority. First, we're going to start with this revisiting, the re-Fauciing, the re-COVIDing of American politics. It's just me today, followed by, I'll have Adam Hamilton on in a bit. As you heard last week, Ravi had surgery for a torn bicep, and he had a doctor's appointment today, so couldn't be here, but he'll surely be back next week. All right, just to kind of set the stage for you about the volume level that they're starting at on this Fauci stuff and how excited they are for it. Let's go to this Newsmax clip.
Try thinking about Tony like this. While your mother was dying of COVID-19, or your brother, or your grandmother, or your daughter, when your teenager was diagnosed with myocarditis or pericarditis, Tony Fauci was at Jake Tapper's house having lobster. They weren't wearing masks. While you were locked down, while your business was forced to close, Tony and Jake were sipping Anisette, making fun of Laura Ingraham. My team has gone through all of this, the entire Tony Fauci man diary, and it is worse than we ever imagined. And this guy's going to testify tomorrow.
Okay, so the message here is pretty clear. We would like for you to be angry about this. It would be very helpful to us if you were angry about this. And it's hard to get people angry about this because the American attention span, particularly the American news cycle, is very quick anymore. And as traumatic and awful as COVID was, it was now a long time ago. And people have pressing concerns in their life day to day. So it's really difficult to get people really mad about this. But they're going to try. Let's go to the first clip from the hearing.
When that story broke, I said to myself, I cannot stand idly on the side and watch this happen. It was about 6 years ago today that I decided I'm going to give up my businesses, sell them all, run for office, run for the United States Senate. Here I am sitting in front of you 6 years later saying, who the fuck do you think you were for doing that?
So that was Senator Bernie Moreno from Ohio, who apparently that's a bit of a crowning achievement in his life, the opportunity to be obscene to the face of Anthony Fauci. But now let's hear from the Republican Senator, Senator Moody from Florida. She's very offended that Anthony Fauci was not a fan of Ron DeSantis.
You called our governor, Governor DeSantis, and I'm going to quote this so I get it right out of your journals, a total jerk, that he is a complete disgrace, that he is blocking local authorities from mandating masks in various locations, including schools. And you were very concerned and upset that we were actively, and I'm going to quote, criticizing you, and we talked virtually every day about being wrong on everything. And what is astounding is that you wrote you feared because of that, because we were questioning our government, because we were fighting back for the truth from our government, from scientifically based recommendations, because we were pushing for that. You said you feared that our democracy is in dire danger.
Okay, next we have Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. No editorial comment needed on how I feel about the senator from my state, but what I will mention before I play this clip is that I don't think there's been much said by Josh Hawley about the fact that the president of the United States has made a couple $2 billion as president, and that his entire family is making a lot of money off him being president. Or, Hawley hasn't had anything to say about the Trump family's corruption, but he apparently has a real problem with one of the better scientists in the country taking a government job and doing that government job for decades instead of going into the private sector, and therefore being paid a very high, for government standards, salary, which results after decades in a very high government pension. Now, mind you, had somebody with Fauci's credentials at any time decided, I'm just going to go to the private sector, would probably make hundreds of millions of dollars. But, you know, in the aftermath of that kind of thing, you get a lot of speeches. Once you do finally leave, you get probably a book deal, things like that. And he's made some money as a result. But let's look at how Josh Hawley, who seems to have nothing to say about the billions of dollars made by Trump, where he is, evidence suggests that he is directly routing opportunities through his government decisions to his bank account, and then having him and his sons cash in on those decisions, which there's no evidence that Fauci did anything like that. Let's listen to Josh Hawley try and pretend that there's a major scandal here.
You know what I can't quite figure out is that why you were so obsessed with it, because you're already rich. I mean, and your scheme worked here. I mean, your net worth now is north of $12 million. You got over $1 million in cash awards during COVID, during a 12-month, 24-month span during COVID. $1 million you knocked down in cash money using federal resources. Now you're worth more than $12 million. You've got a pension that in its first year paid out north of $400,000 a year. 1 million people dead, you're getting rich. 1 million people dead, you're using federal employees to get cash awards for you. 1 million people dead, and you're here taking the fifth because you don't want to admit that what really happened in all that time was a multi-month, multi-year course of self-dealing. Isn't that true, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, well, silence is admission.
Silence is admission if you're not a Republican. So what's sad about this, and there's two more clips we're going to play here in a moment. What's sad about this is there was a time when you didn't have to worry that in order to distract the American people from what's going on in the news, that you would be prosecuted, like with no real evidence that you should be prosecuted. But that's what happens in the Trump administration, is that if you are deemed to be an adversary, they just find a way to prosecute you. If they can't find anything else, they'll make up a mortgage fraud thing. They don't really care about whether they get a conviction. They'd like to, but they know realistically they're not going to. What they care about is trying to ruin your life and bankrupt you by making you spend so much money on lawyers, because Trump thinks that's what he went through, and so he wants all of his adversaries to go through that. And so what's sad to me is that in normal times, Anthony Fauci would sit down, guns a-blazing, figuratively, and engage in this debate and defend himself. But he doesn't feel he can do that because he knows that the end of this road is a prosecution. And all he can do here is feed evidence where there is no evidence, try and give a prosecutor something to hang their hat on, which would probably be if he misremembers something, or if he states an opinion that they try to deem to be a fact, then they try and put him in prison for perjury or obstruction. And it's sad that he just has to sit there and listen to all these folks grandstand on him. So with that said, these last two clips, one, you can just play them in a row if you can, Jeremy. One is, Jesse Waters on Fox News talking about this, followed by Jessica Tarloff, responding to this, which I think gives us the beginning of how to talk about this when it is brought up by your Trump-loving friends and family at the barbecue.
Jesse, at a time when we're hearing that the International Criminal Court is all over Bibi, right? Where are they on the fact that you have, 20 million deaths globally attributed to Chairman Xi? And if there's one American who can give us that story, he's about to get deposed under oath. What do you want to hear?
Well, and if he lies, he can be prosecuted.
That's right.
And so we also know we have evidence that he destroyed evidence. So if he comes out and tells Paul, I didn't do it, boom, felony. You got him. Right. Americans are so jaded about politics because there's so much injustice and no one ever pays the price. I mean, this guy was wrong about everything. and it's all documented. It's like when you make one mistake, you could be like, yeah, I screwed up, I'm sorry. But if you made hundreds of mistakes and lots of people died, what do you say?
Jessica, let me ask you this. I mean, look, obviously the media was very much on his side. Has he lost that seat? What's it going to go with the media here?
Well, I think that there's going to be a push to look at the totality of Anthony Fauci's career, which spans, over 50 years, and a lot of very good things that he did, especially when it comes to the AIDS epidemic and being the chief architect of PEPFAR, which was, one of W's crowning achievements and is credited with saving 25 million lives. That's a really big deal. Treating Ebola patients himself, going back to the 1960s and leading this NIH team that repurposed cancer therapies to save the lives of people with a fatal rheumatological condition. The guy has done real stuff.
So that is the beginning of how I would respond when people bring this up. And look, I don't know if people are going to bring this up to you. It's kind of hard to tell. This is one of those stories that is like going like gangbusters in a certain corner of the right-wing media world, right? They're getting the reason that Fox is talking about it like crazy. The reason Newsmax is talking about it like crazy is because people aren't turning the channel when they're talking about it. So, and that probably has a little to do with the fact that they don't have a lot of situations right now where they're on offense against the other side, right? I mean, most of what they're having to do is counter program against the enormous errors that the Trump administration is making, against the really dumb things that Trump is saying, and against his really bad poll numbers and the really bad poll numbers of Republicans. So they have a moment here to go back in time to when, they were sort of in the minority pushing against things, and they want to do that. Now, I say that in the minority because that's how they remember it. They remember all of COVID as though it was Joe Biden and Anthony Fauci making them wear masks, not letting kids go to school, and a lot of people dying. And that's how they remember it. But that's not what actually happened, right? If you recall, the lockdowns began in early 2020, and Donald Trump was still president of the United States, and Anthony Fauci was in the same job that he'd been in for several prior presidents. And Donald Trump has tried to make everybody forget that the one decent thing that his administration did was Operation Warp Speed to try and get a vaccine in a big hurry. And now he distances himself from that like crazy. He acts like, vaccine? What vaccine? People forget that a lot of the early lockdown stuff came from the federal government. Now, what they say is, well, that was Anthony Fauci. He was just put in charge of it. Okay, but your dude put him in charge of it. That was Trump who put him in charge of that. And that was Trump who was doing press conferences with Fauci every single day. So it's a little icky there, right? It's a little sticky for them. So I would say all the things that Jessica Tarloff just said in that clip. I would talk about the entirety of Fauci's career, but then I would remember that Anthony Fauci is not like the Democratic nominee in 2028 for president of the United States. He is not a person who you, in order to win people over in an argument, have to defend, every decision that he ever made. I'm sure that Anthony Fauci thinks that not every decision that he ever made worked out very well. So I would say all of those things about his career and the service that he gave and the importance of it and the value of it. But I would also recognize that when COVID happened, nobody really knew what to do. And the science was changing constantly. And there was a fair amount of guessing happening. And so, yes, absolutely, there were times when the federal government, led by Donald Trump, but under the advice of Fauci, made decisions that were sort of, let's be overly cautious. We don't know whether you should wipe down all of your groceries with Clorox wipes. We don't actually know. So maybe just wipe down all your groceries with Clorox wipes, which I remember doing. And I remember being like pretty freaked out about it. We don't know to the degree to which kids are vectors for COVID. So let's shut down school for a while until we figure that out. Because what's the alternative when you don't know, and maybe you even have some evidence that they might not be? can you in good conscience, without complete information, send children to school if you think there's a possibility that the disease may change or that some of the early information is wrong and they could die from COVID? So, you can see where some of the choices turned out with further information to be the wrong choices. But you can also see, given the information at the time, how some of those choices were made. And so that's what I would say to people. If I were having a conversation with like a conservative cousin or something, I would say, look, if you go back in time, you have to remember that we didn't know the stuff that we know now. And so there was a lot of guessing, and somebody had to do that guessing. And if you're in that position, you're probably going to err on the extreme side of caution because you're worried. And maybe you're not a person who would err on the extreme side of caution. But if you're not a person who would err on the extreme side of caution, you probably don't get that job and keep that job across multiple administrations of both parties, unless you are the person who says, I'm not going to mess around with any sort of public pandemic possibility. I'm always going to look for the safest possible thing. And then I'll let the politicians around me take that information and decide whether to do the safest possible thing or whether to balance it against things like the economy, quality of life. Because remember, that wasn't actually Anthony Fauci's job. Anthony Fauci was not the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Anthony Fauci was not the Secretary of Commerce or the Secretary of Treasury. He was not on the Council of Economic Advisors. Anthony Fauci was in charge of a pandemic and a response to a pandemic. And that's what happened. And in that situation, he's like, when you call a SWAT team, right? You don't call in the SWAT team for a cat in a tree. You don't call in a SWAT team for, a suspicious person, right? But when you do call in the SWAT team comes in and does what the SWAT team is trained to do. And that's what he was doing, was coming in and doing what he was trained to do. Now, it is the responsibility of the people who have appointed him and who oversee him to decide where to tell him, no, we can't do that, and we can do that, and we can't do this one. But they didn't do that. And so now what they want to do is they want to go back and they want to say, hey, you made all these choices. And some of these choices you made for public health turned out to be unhelpful when it came to the economy. They turned out to be unhelpful when it came to our quality of life. It turned out kids didn't necessarily need to miss school for as long as they did. And so now we want to yell at you in front of Congress. And what's sad about that is that while I think Anthony Fauci clearly made a lot of mistakes, one thing I'm quite sure of is that Anthony Fauci was trying his hardest. And to go back to Jessica Tarlov's argument, he had done a pretty dang good job in a whole lot of other possible crises that we barely remember as crises because he did a pretty dang good job. And in this one, it was too late by the time he got involved. It had spread from China and he couldn't stop it. Now, you could then transition into talking about the decisions that have been made since then by the second Trump administration to completely zero out all of our pandemic response possibilities around the world, which makes it even more likely that a pandemic reaches this country again. But what I would focus on is not trying to defend every single decision Anthony Fauci made, but rather point out that Anthony Fauci was not the only decision maker in that situation, and that there is a reason that they want to talk about this so badly right now. And that reason was the Epstein files. And now, well, it's two things. If I'm being totally honest, one is they're just not doing very well politically. And this is something that can get their base charged up again because their base is pretty upset. And this gets us to the second thing. The second reason, their base is extremely upset at what a terrible job they're doing. But specifically, they're really mad about the war in Iran because one of the big reasons that the base was pushing for Trump is they said no new wars, no new forever wars, no new wars in the Middle East. And the base of the Democratic Party and the base of the Republican Party are really united on something right now. And that is they think that the war in Iran is one of the stupidest things that a president has done in a really long time. And so this is something where they can say, hey, remember how we all got together in the first place over COVID? It's sort of like, in a marriage that's failing. You remember our honeymoon? That's sort of the purpose of this, which brings us to discuss what's going on in Iran right now. And let's just start with this first clip from Fox News about the supposed beating that we're about to hand down.
Trump reacting to that Iranian attack on U.S. forces overnight in Jordan. President Trump tells Fox News about Iran, "We are going to beat the effing S out of them." He went on to say, "We'll be hitting them hard. They're going to get a beating." So clearly the United States is going to respond to what the president described as a surprise attack. He says U.S. forces had just minutes to shoot down these incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. The president says he has reviewed video of the shoot down, and it was U.S. forces conducting this operation to defend that area. He said it was real time. They were calling out coordinates and ensuring that none of this incoming Iranian fire got through.
All right, so remember what the reporter on Fox just said about the surprise attack, because we're gonna come back to that in a few minutes. Let's go to this next one, where it's yet again President Trump claiming that a deal is possible. We're constantly told. Now, by the way, we had a deal. I don't know if you remember. The war ended a while back, and we had a deal, and now suddenly, recently we don't have a deal, and there's a war happening again, but it's not an all-out war, see, because Congress said you can't do that. So they're just like restarting the clock. They're just starting over, and now we just have continually, they call it, where the ceasefire is interrupted, which sounds a lot like a war. And I'm guessing if you're on the receiving end or live near people who are on the receiving end of American and Israeli and now Saudi missiles, you probably feel like it's not a ceasefire. It probably feels like a war. But let's hear from him again about how, a deal is imminent. Everything's going great.
Are you on the same page on Iran, you and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Close, yeah, pretty close. We have a little difference, but pretty close, yeah. Iran took a beating over the last 14 days, and they asked us very nicely, please stop, let's meet. And that's what we are right now. We'll see what happens. If we don't make a deal, we go back to the same thing.
All right. So, hey, look, Iran is saying things. I'm surprised he didn't drop a "sir" in there. They're saying things like, "Oh, please, can we meet? Please stop it," right? But at the same time, Iran is launching surprise attacks on us, which makes no sense. So it's worth revisiting. What are we even doing here in the first place? And I would reiterate my feeling, which is that we got into this war for a couple of reasons. One, it makes him feel big. It makes him feel like a big man to get to use this military and talk about how, tough of a military it is and how impressive these explosions are and how we're just beating the heck out of him. He loves to say that kind of stuff as if he's in a fist fight and he's doing the beating, as opposed to just, saying, go ahead, do the thing that you propose possibly doing. That's part of it. The other part of it is that Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying to get every president for years, like for going back decades, to do this. And I always compare it to, that text message, that phishing text you get that's like, are you coming to the barbecue? They're really just trying to engage you so they can scam you. And Netanyahu's been sending that text message to presidents for several administrations. And this one just responded and was like, what barbecue? I'll see you there and I'll bring my wallet. That's how we got here. But let's go ahead and go to this next clip where we get into this surprise attack idea again.
In the Oval great. In terms of possible talks with the Iranian regime, the president says we're going to let them keep talking. Remember, the Iranians came to President Trump after 13 straight days of U.S. bombing against Iran, asking to meet about the Strait of Hormuz and their broader nuclear ambitions. And those talks are taking place as we speak behind the scenes. And then this surprise attack launched against U.S. forces overnight. And again, President Trump telling Fox News we are going to beat the effing S out of them, and that U.S. strikes will take place against Iran in response to the surprise attack overnight against U.S. forces in Jordan.
Okay. First of all, almost all attacks are surprise attacks in war, if they are remotely effective. Element of surprise is generally what you're going for. Two, to refer to this over and over again, and I'm not in any way defending the regime in Iran, nor am I in any way rooting for the regime in Iran. But it is important to recognize why they're using the words they're using. using terms like surprise attack and then saying, we were talking. Well, yeah, we've been talking off and on, and we've been bombing them off and on. Like when they don't give us what we want, or when they block the strait, or when we try to block the strait and they shoot at us, then we attack them. And I bet when we put together those attack plans, we try and figure out how we could do it with the element of surprise, because that's how you make an attack effective. So this idea that it is this surprise attack that is happening in the midst of a war and therefore needs to be responded to because it is a surprise is a little specious in my mind. But let's get back to this idea of how did we get here in the first place? We know that it has everything to do with Netanyahu, and Trump knows that too, and he can't say it, but you can tell he's kind of burned up about it. And let's look at this clip where he calls into Fox and is talking to them, and he talks about Netanyahu.
You say that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. There are reports now that Netanyahu is going to talk to you about ongoing excavation at Pickaxe Mountain, construction vehicles entering and exiting tunnels, paving new access roads. Satellite imagery and intel indicates that Iran is actively constructing and fortifying Pickaxe Mountain. How will we respond?
Well, I don't need Bibi to tell me that. Bibi's telling me that because he wants me to stay involved. I mean, I don't necessarily. We have the finest, because of Space Force, we have the greatest cameras in the world focused on. We know exactly what's going on. But no, I heard Bibi announce that. I said, why don't you just tell it to me? Why do you have to announce it to the world? I know exactly what's going on at Pickaxe. It's not a big problem. We took out their nuclear sites, and we'll have to take out Pickaxe if we don't make a deal. If we don't make a deal, we'll take it out very easily.
All right. Let me get this straight. Put the Netanyahu part aside for a second. Many months ago, we obliterated, apparently, their nuclear program. And we had to do that not because we trashed the deal that existed that kept them from getting a nuclear weapon. No. That's definitely not why. We just did it because they were getting a nuclear weapon. But now they're not getting a nuclear weapon. But now we got to go to war to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And now they have another nuclear facility that we might have to take out if we don't make a deal. Now, a deal can't stop a nuclear weapon, but a Trump deal maybe could stop a nuclear weapon, but it may not. And we've obliterated their nuclear program, but they do have a nuclear program, and we might have to take it out. But don't worry, because we know exactly how to take it out. But we haven't, even though we said that was the point of the war, or one of the points of the war. And then we get to the Netanyahu part. Clearly, he understands that he's been catfished into this entire thing by Netanyahu. And by the way, there's a reason that I always say Netanyahu and don't say Israel, because Israel is a country made up of a lot of people, the majority of whom don't want Netanyahu to be in charge and haven't wanted him to be in charge for a couple of years. And he's just hanging on to power. And one of the ways he's doing that is by continually keeping the country at war so that they can't have elections, vote him out of office, and make him subject to the corruption convictions that he would be subject to on completely other stuff if he were to leave office, which is an aside, which is why I don't say things like, because Israel got him to do it. It's why I say Netanyahu got him to do it. And that is not so much like a pro-Israel position as that is me just sympathizing with the people in Israel who don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, because I am a person in America who doesn't like Donald Trump. And I don't want the rest of the world saying things like, America is always attacking Iran. America, is getting us into all these wars. America is causing all these problems, because I'm an American who's against all those things. And what I hope, my greatest hope, is that around the world, when people think of things like the Iran war, when they think of what we're going to get into in a moment, the bombings in the Caribbean, when they think of all these terrible things, my hope is that they think of Donald Trump and they don't think of America as a whole perpetrating these things, because I think that's really important to the future of America. And frankly, because I, as a human being of good moral upbringing and hopefully strong character, does not want to be associated with the actions of Donald Trump. And I don't want them to be thought of as the actions of America. And so I try to give people in Israel the same benefit of the doubt. But all that said, let's stay on this Iran thing and let's look at the latest headlines, which are about the United States and Saudi Arabia launching attacks against Tehran-backed militias in Iraq. Now, this has sort of gone under the radar, but I really want to make sure that we notice this because what happened is there were some attacks in Iraq by Tehran-backed militias, and a lot of those attacks, just like the Houthi attacks in Yemen, have been against Saudi oil assets. And so as a result, the Saudis are responding and attacking them, but the United States is also attacking and defending those Saudi oil assets. So I point this out to say it's kind of flying under the radar, but it's important to keep track of the fact that Donald Trump not only has us now fighting a war, not for, because Israel is involved, but really for the interests of Netanyahu, right? But now also Saudi Arabia and the Saudi royal family. So now we are using the American military and the American tax dollar to kill people in defense of one country that is not our country, and really in defense of one Trump-like leader in Israel. And now also the Saudi royal family and their oil assets like that. So it's two countries we're doing that with now. Now, while all this has been going on, there's also been continued bombings in the Caribbean, which, do you remember that story? That's kind of fallen out of the news. We've still been bombing boats and killing people in the Caribbean, none of which we have any actual evidence are narco traffickers. And by the way, even if they are, it's still a crime to just blow them out of the water and give them no due process. There's been more than 220 deaths. And the DEA analysis says that the strikes have failed to curb the cocaine supply at all, right? So the whole idea of this was supposed to be, at first, by the way, they tried to make it about fentanyl and opioids, but like nobody was buying that. So they were like, oh, it's about cocaine. But it turns out, I mean, we already knew that it wasn't going to do anything about fentanyl because that's not what anybody was smuggling out of there. But now it turns out it's done absolutely zero to curb the supply of cocaine into the United States. So when you talk about this with people, like for one thing, we shouldn't be doing this because it's against the law and it's immoral, and we have no evidence that these are the actual people doing this. And on top of that, we've just made up the idea that they're terrorists because they are, even if they are right that they are trafficking in drugs, that makes it criminal. It doesn't actually make them terrorists, but now we're just calling them terrorists so that we can blow them out of the water, right? Let's go to this clip where they talk about this on News Nation and sum this up well.
New reporting suggests the Trump administration's military strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats might not be as successful as they say. The Washington Post reports the strikes have not reduced the amount of cocaine entering the United States, and that criminals and traffickers are instead just changing their tactics and routes to avoid possible military strikes. The Washington Post, in their analysis based on assessments from the DEA in part, reports that while smuggling routes were disrupted in the first few months after the strikes began, Operation Southern Spear has also, quote, failed to affect the supply or the price of cocaine in the U.S. President Trump has said otherwise, saying the strikes, which have killed more than 200 people since September, have stopped nearly all of the drugs coming into the U.S. A White House spokesperson to News Nation called these new reports laughable, saying the president is using every tool at his disposal. The Pentagon told us Operation Southern Spear is accomplishing exactly what it was designed to do: detect, disrupt, and dismantle designated terrorist organizations and the networks they rely on.
So I wanted to play the response where they say that at the end about destroy, these terrorist networks, because I wanted to make the point that this is how you turn these people into terrorist networks. This is how you take narco traffickers who are just organized crime. That's what they are, right? And you blow up some of them, presumably, but a whole lot of innocent people who are just fishing. This is how you turn South America into the 2020s and 2030s into the Middle East in the 90s and early 2000s is you kill a lot of innocent people with your military, and you claim that it's a matter of your own self-defense when it is not. And that's how you gin up that sort of resentment. And that's how you get actual terrorists. That's, by the way, much closer to the United States than when they're all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So I wanted to make that point. But we're going to go to an ad in a second. But before we do, you should know that when we come back, we're going to talk about the last piece of this story, which is one of the more disturbing things that I've heard in a long time. And it has been completely undercovered, which is about this prosecutor that has been assassinated who in Ecuador, who was looking into the kidnappings and torture, allegedly, of fishermen off their coast by the United States military. So we're going to hit that when we come back, and we'll talk to Adam Hamilton, the Democratic candidate for Kansas, for U.S. Senate in Kansas.
Nutrafol is the #1 dermatologist recommended hair growth supplement brand used by over 1.5 million people. And a lot of people in my life been taking Nutrafol for a while now. And what I've heard is that people have had tremendous hair growth, less shedding, more confidence, and their formula is built for men at different life stages. So Nutrafol Men for guys 18 to 49, and then they have this new Nutrafol Men 50 Plus, which is the first product of its kind specifically made for men over 50 years old. And you know, what you need to do is address the root causes of thinning wherever you're at in life. And Nutrafol will help you grow visibly thicker, fuller hair in 3 to 6 months. That's no time at all. They're backed by peer-reviewed studies and NSF certified for Sport, the gold standard for supplement quality. And you know exactly what you're putting in your body. So, and here's something particularly cool. And I know Jason's going to like this. Nutrafol is the official hair growth partner of Major League Baseball. Those are the guys who perform at the highest level, and they trust Nutrafol to stay on top of their hair game. So start Nutrafol today and make the hat optional. Visit Nutrafol.com and enter the promo code MAJORITY for $10 off your first month's subscription and free shipping. Find out why Nutrafol is the best-selling hair growth supplement brand at Nutrafol.com, spelled Nutrafol.com, promo code MAJORITY. That's Nutrafol.com, promo code MAJORITY. As summer plans heat up, stay fresh from sunup to sundown with Mack Weldon's AirKnit X fabric. It all started with underwear designed with wick moisture to fight odor and give you maximum airflow. Now they're expanding that bestseller to a full line of essentials. Browse the full AirKnit X collection at MackWeldon.com, plus get 20% off your first order of $125 or more with code MAJORITY. The AirKnit X collection is wildly comfortable, from the boxer briefs to the socks. I've never felt more confident and ready to take on the day, knowing how secure and fresh I am. In my opinion, Mack Weldon far exceeds other brands I've used before. Mack Weldon's AirKnit X fabric is a summer staple. Their lighter fabric is fused with nylon mesh for maximum airflow, and your summer rotation is covered, even the sweatiest parts. The whole collection started as underwear, boxer briefs, trunks, and those types of things, and now it includes undershirts, t-shirts, polos, and socks. And look, this summer, add pieces built to last. They make quality clothing that holds up longer than one rough season. Their designs balance classic pieces with updated details to keep you looking sharp, easy to style, and versatile looks that you don't have to think about. Mack Weldon is effortless by design. Mack Weldon clothes are designed to fit your style and the demands of modern life. So for over 10 years, they've designed timeless, innovative menswear to help you move through the day with confidence, even if you're just hanging in your underwear. Don't sweat the heat this summer. Feel as effortlessly cool as you look with Mack Weldon. Go to MackWeldon.com and get 20% off your first order of $125 or more with the promo code MAJORITY. That's MackWeldon.com, code MAJORITY.
All right, we're going to bring in Adam Hamilton, Pastor Adam Hamilton, the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to turn you to this story that nobody has seen, and Jeremy had to point out to me. It's a story on DropSite, which is a legit, investigative, independent news service, and it's about this prosecutor who is investigating U.S. boat strikes and claims of torture, who was just assassinated in Ecuador. And I'm going to read to you some excerpts from this article. Alexandra Bravo, the prosecutor assigned to investigate U.S. strikes on 3 Ecuadorian boats and the 36 survivors' subsequent accounts of torture and kidnapping, was shot dead in the coastal city of Manta last month. According to police, on June 14th, a hitman aboard a black motorcycle opened fire on Bravo as she and her sister were leaving a cafe at about 11 a.m. Bravo's sister, who jumped to protect her, was also killed in the attack. Upon arriving at the crime scene, officers say they found 5 9mm shell casings and Bravo's injured driver, but no sign of the police detail that had been assigned to protect her. The police directorate, which operates entirely under the executive branch, has launched a probe to determine if there had been an internal security breach. Bravo, the prosecutor, had been working for Fiorella, Negra Francisca, and Don Maca, had been working these cases, right? And one of these is this case, which is a series of drone attacks on civilian fishing ships exposed by DropSite in April. But 2 of the boat's crews returned home and reported being abducted, blindfolded, and starved for 8 days by American gunmen in U.S. military uniforms aboard a U.S.-flagged patrol ship before being abandoned in El Salvador. The UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances endorsed the calls for an investigation, demanding that the U.S. provide information on the whereabouts of the 8 still missing men and any involvement in the matter by April 27th. And to date, the United States has not responded. Under Ecuador's right-wing president, Daniel Noboa, who is a Miami-born billionaire often characterized as a U.S.-backed dictator, the country has become a central testing ground for Operation Southern Spear, which is Washington's extrajudicial bombing campaign purporting to target narco-terrorists, which has killed 221 people to date, as we talked about. There's no evidence that many of the victims, including those in Bravo's investigation, had engaged in drug trafficking. We're about almost done here, but a source inside the Manta Police Department who knew Bravo personally told DropSite that the Ecuadorian prosecutor was under pressure from her superiors at the Attorney General's office to treat the U.S. attacks as exclusively cases of disappearance. The source, who asked for anonymity, said Bravo was told to close all lines of inquiry about 36 of the 44 missing men that were found, despite arriving with severe injuries, including 70% vision loss and feet torn to flesh and bone, which medical experts found consistent with their accounts of explosions and torture. A senior researcher with Human Rights Watch, who interviewed Bravo as part of the investigation, similarly recalled Bravo facing internal challenges within the institution itself to advance the investigation. So then, after their last meeting on May 8th, that researcher told DropSite that Bravo was still in the initial stages of inquiry and investigation, and that Bravo was investigating a country, the United States, that has been positioned in the media as an ally against crime. That investigation had not advanced at all, and that stems from an intention to avoid getting into trouble or problems with anyone. It goes on to talk about how she had been relocated, and nobody in the Ecuadorian executive branch will say why she had just recently been relocated, why she didn't all of a sudden have her security detail with her, why she had been told she was no longer allowed to investigate this thing, and it appears she was continuing to investigate this. And then jumping to the end here, it points out that the U.S. Coast Guard and the military have claimed over and over again that they weren't doing anything in that area, that there's no way this could have been them, right? But despite that, both governments stonewalling the investigation, evidence continues to emerge supporting the fishermen's accounts of abduction, airstrikes, and torture. DropSite obtained exclusive video of U.S. Coast Guard activity in the vicinity of the bombing, open source intelligence that corroborates their testimonies, and police interviews with eyewitnesses that confirm the U.S. involvement alleged by survivors and documented by DropSite. DropSite published videos taken by fishermen in that area that day, at that time, around that time, of U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. military ships literally in the place that the United States government is saying, no, we weren't there. The U.S. maintains that it never interacted with any of these boats, and that all they did was eventually they did a search and rescue mission when they had put out a Mayday when these boats had. That's what the Coast Guard claims happened. But DropSite said that based on tracking data of their movements, that there was a Coast Guard cutter right near that boat at the time of the bombing, right before it turned off its signal, only to reappear off the shore of Costa Rica the same day that the crew was taken into Central American waters and transferred to El Salvador's Naval Command with mangled limbs and major burn injuries. I could go on, but the point of this is I think it's entirely possible that we are doing things like this around the world right now, including in the Caribbean, where I just said that we're like actually doing things that will cause us to have true terrorist groups aimed at us from South America. We're apparently kidnapping fishermen, torturing them, putting them in another country, and then denying we were ever there. And then it is possible that we had an involvement in assassinating the prosecutor who was insisting on investigating our country for doing that. And if not, then it is likely that it is a Trump-aligned dictator that either ordered or did nothing to stop or cleared the way for that assassination. And as a former member of the United States military, that is heartbreaking that we would be doing anything like that. And it's frightening. So with that, we're going to switch gears for a moment, and we're going to talk to Pastor Adam Hamilton. We won't necessarily talk about this. We're just going to talk about his campaign and about some other things going on in the news. But I wanted you to meet Pastor Hamilton because I sat down with him recently, and he is a fifth-generation Kansan. He's a pastor, as I mentioned. He's an author. He's a candidate for the U.S. Senate. And he leads the largest United Methodist congregation in the United States. It has 24,000 members. It's just on the other side of the state line. So I'm here in Kansas City, Missouri. And I was at your church the other day, Adam, teaching. We were teaching the women in the Afghan family that we brought over how to drive because they just got their learner's permits and they had never driven before. And your church is so big, we were using, I didn't ask you beforehand, sorry. We were using, yeah. So I want people to know about your campaign because it's truly unique. You are, excuse this term, but this is how people would colloquially refer to it, the founder and pastor of a mega church. That's how people would often refer to it. I'm sure that is not how you think of your congregation. No. But when people think of that, they think of fire and brimstone conservatives and that sort of thing. But you are running as a Democrat for the U.S. Senate in Kansas. Best way to start is tell us about how you came to this decision.
Yeah, sure. Well, in some ways, I spent the last year and a half struggling with what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now and feeling like this is not normal. These things that we're doing are counter to our sense of values as Americans, our sense of justice, the things you described a moment ago, and so much more. And I found myself thinking, somebody's got to do something. This is just not okay. And our sitting senator in Kansas, Roger Marshall, who is up for election right now, seems to be primarily a spokesperson for the president. And I would have these arguments in my head with him like, dude, speak up. You've got to speak up. Your job, you were not hired by the president to be a spokesperson. You were hired by the people of Kansas to be their champion. And things that are happening in Washington, D.C. that you're supporting are hurting people back in Kansas. And so anyway, after a year of my wife's, hearing me say, somebody's got to do something, she finally looked at me in January and said, maybe you need to do something. You've been a pastor for 38 years. You care about people. You listen. You have empathy. You have compassion. You've worked to solve problems in our city. You've developed a huge organization. You know how to manage. And we've 450 staff, a $32 million budget, which is small by corporate comparisons, but for a nonprofit organization like ours, pretty significant. And she said, you've made a difference. Maybe you're the one who could make a difference here. And I'd had people telling me over the last year, you may be the one person who could defeat Roger Marshall in the election next year, this coming fall. So anyway, we jumped in after, crossing the state of Kansas, listening to people and asking, how do you feel about what's happening in Washington? What would you hope for in your next United States senator? And after we listened, prayed, we finally came back and said, okay, we're willing to jump in. So we jumped in 3 months ago, and it's been an amazing ride since.
Well, and you just talked about it, rightfully so, as a nonprofit organization, which, being in this community and having had the opportunity to watch the growth of the Church of the Resurrection, that is truly how it operates. This is not something where I think when people think of churches of this size, we know what they think of, right? Mm-hmm. But I've seen in this community, I've seen the ways in which you have done things to make the community better, and you have taken very seriously the idea that, faith without works is dead. Am I recalling correctly that at one point you actually got into like a legal battle with the municipality in which you were located because they weren't letting you house the homeless?
That was actually an organization we support, and that was in another part of the county. But yeah, that was one of those things. But our focus has always been on, how are we sending people out? So if you're serious about your faith, then the question is, how do you live that out in your daily lives? And every Sunday, the idea is let's send people out to go transform our world. And so we're constantly looking at, where does the world not look the way it's supposed to look? Jesus described that as the kingdom of God, but you might think about it as, just the world as it's meant to be. And so for us, among those things, we're the largest source of food in the Kansas City area after Harvesters, the community food bank, largest source of blood in Kansas City. When we found out kids were, from the schools that we partner with, we found out kids didn't have beds. We started a beds ministry and provided, I think, 3,000 beds to children who didn't have beds to sleep on. When Swope Health on the Missouri side of the state line needed a second mobile dental clinic, we provided a $500,000 grant to build that so that 2,700 children a year could receive dental care who were not receiving it up to that point. And we've had a partnership with 13 elementary schools and preschools in the lowest income communities in Kansas City for now 25 years, and invested about $10 million in that and hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours. And so that's just the heart of our congregation, is if there's a place that's, where there's brokenness or people need help or hope, we're going to jump in.
That's why I wanted to have you on the show, is because there's so many people who, the point of this show is that it's for people who feel like they're surrounded by folks who are very conservative and they're trying to bring them over to their side, or just they're trying to convince the people who they know who are caught between those two folks in a friend group. They're trying to bring them to their part of the friend. When they talk to people about, being a Christian, for instance, I'm sure so many people listening to this have had conversations where they say, I don't understand why you think that, what Trump is doing is Christian. What is to be Christian is to try to help others. And so I know that this audience is going to love you. And I think also I'd be interested for you to tell them more about how bipartisan your congregation is, how this was not an easy decision because of the nature of your congregation. It's not like every progressive in, Kansas is in this congregation and that's it. I mean, could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So when we started the church, our aim was to bring people together. So, we're so divided as a society, and it's just gotten worse. But our congregation today, 35% Republican, 35% Democrat, 30% independent. When we, I'm constantly trying to remind people, look, let's focus on what we agree upon, what we share in common. And then when we talk about things that are controversial, that our folks disagree upon, how do we listen so we understand where the other person's coming from? And when I'm preaching on controversial issues, I'm always going to try to make sure, okay, I understand this is where this group is coming from. This is where this group's coming from. Now I'll share with you where I'm coming from. I could be wrong, but this is how I see it. I wrote a book a number of years ago called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White. And the whole book was a series of essays focused on the fact that we have a tendency to see the world in black and white terms, and there's some gray in the world. Now there is black and white. Abusing children is always wrong. Hate is wrong. Racism is wrong. But there's a lot of things about which we can find some common ground. And if we start to do that, we all of a sudden find out, we're not that different. We actually, and what I believe is we need more of that today. What's happening in politics and in Washington is politicians are doing a great job of dividing us. They try to come up with ways of talking about issues that are meant to inflame, meant to, animate the base. And instead we find people divided. And I was in Greensburg, Kansas the other day, and a woman said to me, she said, I was asking, what would you want in your next senator? She said, well, one thing I really want is, instead of somebody who's constantly dividing me from my friends, I would like somebody who helps me remember I'm supposed to care about them, that I'm supposed to love them, even if we disagree. And she said, right now I see people with those red ball caps and I feel hate inside or anger inside. And I don't want to agree. I don't agree with them. I'm never going to agree with them, but I don't want to hate them. And I think that's a one piece of what I'm running on. It's only one piece. I'm really running on affordability and dealing with the things that are happening in DC that are causing harm to ordinary people in Kansas and other states. I'm running on the issues of healthcare and the fact that 51,000 people in Kansas, when President Trump took office in 2025, had health insurance that don't have it anymore. And that's criminal. It's just not right. But I'm also running on how do we move away from this so polarized, divided society? And at least the 68% of Republicans who claim to be moderates and the 68% of Democrats who claim to be moderates, how do we begin to bring conversations together? And so that's true in our church. We have a congregation where we don't have the far ends of the spectrum, but we have a whole lot of people in that broad center, and that's where most Americans live. And I think we got to get back to that. You think about, George McGovern and Bob Dole, who worked together to create what's today the SNAP program, and also what has been USAID. I mean, we got to bring people together to solve really big problems.
Yeah, I think that you can win this race, and I want to talk about that for a moment, because there are people listening to this who pay pretty close attention to the midterms, and they pay particularly close attention probably to the Senate races because there's just few of them, and so therefore they're easier to keep track of, and they're big races. And I can remember when I ran for the Senate in 2016, when, to the extent that people remember that, and you got to be a pretty dedicated political nerd to remember specific
I remember
Senate
it. I was paying attention to your race.
Well, I appreciate it. But when people remember it, often they remember it as a competitive race the entire way. And that's not how we knew that, because we were in it. We saw the polling. We saw the possibilities. We knew what our plan was and how we were going to execute it. But really, that was 21 months. And it was about 18 or 19 months of toiling and obscurity, and starting to get some notice within the state, but still the vast majority of the country not really having any idea that there was going to be a really competitive race in Missouri. And then, when we got toward the end and we started to be able to run our ads, and we caught up in name recognition, and people became, people just sort of shifted their focus toward, there's an election coming up. That's when we started to pull our head in the polls, and, yada, yada, Comey letter, we ended up losing by a couple points. But I think that this race is really similar. And I think but I think you're going to win it. And I think what's going to happen is that in probably the next 6 to 8 weeks, all of a sudden, people who pay attention to this around the country are going to be like, have you heard about this thing in Kansas? And they're going to, to them, it'll be like you just announced your candidacy, but you've been doing this the whole time. So for those people who are listening to this, let's give them an earlier preview than the people who are going to hear about it in the national news in a few weeks. Tell them about your fundraising success. Tell them about where the race sits from a polling perspective, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So we got in 3 months ago. So I'd wrestled with this for a year, jumped in kind of late 3 months ago, and 3 months this week. And as we jumped in, we found, so the first week we put up a website, we had 1,000 people sign up to volunteer from across the state of Kansas. As I was going out visiting, as I go across the state, I walk into places and people, I've written 36 books. So they've been used by Sunday school classes and Bible studies in moderate to progressive churches for the last, 20 years. And I walk into a room in Western Kansas that's typically hard Republican. And they're like, Pastor Adam, you've been our Sunday school teacher for the last 20 years. And so all of these people are people who they might not have thought to vote for a Democrat before, but they're like, but we know you, we know what you stand for. And like, we know you're going to try to bring people together and you stand for the things we believe in. And so that's been exciting. When we started raising money. So in our first quarter, and for us, the first quarter into June 30th, we only had 2 months of that first quarter. And we raised $3.66 million. And that $3.66 million was more than any candidate in the history of Kansas had raised, Republican or Democrat, in their first quarter, and 6 times more than our sitting Senator Roger Marshall raised. And we raised it from thousands of people across Kansas. He raised $600,000 in that same quarter, $613,000. And I think there were only 27 named Kansans who donated to his campaign. And so half of it, I think, or about 40% of it came from corporate PACs. We're not taking corporate PAC money.
He got money from the 27 Kansans who lobby in D.C., probably.
That's probably right. I think he got more money I actually know this is true, more money from people in Florida. And you may not know this, but the people in Kansas know that when our senator's not in Washington, a fair chunk of the time he's in Florida. And I'm like, hey, that's great. His grandkids live there. I just want to encourage him. Let's go ahead and retire you. And so you can go enjoy your grandkids more, but don't pretend like you're in Kansas and you're representing these people. So anyway, so the finances have been really good. The numbers, 25 or 30% of the people who are supporting me are Republicans. I walk in and people, every event I do, 20 or 30% are Republicans saying, you know what, we don't agree with what's happening in Washington. That is not who we are. And we know who you are. And I've never voted for a Democrat before, or I've never held a fundraiser for a Democrat, but I believe in you and what you stand for. And you're going to bring us together and you're going to solve problems. And so it's been fun. I mean, so in our polling, so in the primary, we're 17 points above our next highest contender in the Democratic primary. we feel confident about the primary. And when it comes to the general, we are pulling neck and neck with Roger Marshall, which is pretty remarkable right now. And to be at this place in a pretty red state with a sitting Republican incumbent with the president's endorsement, and yet we're running neck and neck. And a lot of the groups who have endorsed him in the past are not endorsing.
Well, and let's meditate for a moment on the fact that you're running neck and neck with the incumbent U.S. senator when you have not run for office before. You have probably pretty darn good for somebody who's not run for office before, name recognition throughout Kansas. But at the same time, I bet that there are people who know who you are and like you who still may not even know you're running for the U.S. Senate yet because you haven't really started to deploy those assets on TV. You haven't. So to be run and in Kansas, where my family has been in Kansas City, Missouri, going back now, if you count my kids, 6 generations. But my folks took a job right before I was born in Kansas, working for the government there. So I grew up just on the Kansas side of the state line before moving back after college. So I grew up in Kansas, and the idea that you are this far out from an election running neck and neck as a Democrat is a humongous deal. And so I want people to recognize that while everybody is focused on, rightfully, what's going to happen in Maine now, are we going to be able to win that election? What about Ohio? Those are all really important, but people don't realize that there's an enormous pickup opportunity in a place where at the beginning of this cycle, the Republicans did not think they would have to defend it at all.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's the sleeper race, and people are starting to figure it out. People in DC and New York are starting to figure out. I had a phone call just before I got on with you. Somebody in New York's like, I can't believe it. This is for real. You guys are a chance nobody thought was going to happen. And when Kansas sends a Democrat to the United States Senate for the first time in 94 years, it's sending a message. That's what I tell in my stump speeches. We are saying together, what's happening in Washington is not okay. This is not normal. It's not just, it's not moral. It's just, this is not right. And Kansans are fed up. They're not going to put up with this anymore. And so it's exciting. I mean, it's pretty fun, but if people aren't paying attention, I really hope they will pay attention and see, because this is going to be a real race.
Well, there are 2 reasons that I endorsed you and that I wanted to have you on the show. One is, well, there's probably 3, right? One is I think you're a great guy, and I've known about your work for a long time and have interacted with it from afar. 2, I think you can win this race, which is hugely important for the country. And the third is I actually think you're going to be great at this. And I think for people listening who are thinking about who to support either inside or outside their state, it's great to pick up a seat, particularly one that the national press didn't expect or the national prognosticators didn't expect, which could happen here. But it's even better to get somebody who, like, the Senate desperately needs, but more than that, the progressives desperately need as a national messenger, and not just progressives, like everybody kind of needs as a national messenger. So I'm really excited for it. Tell people how they can support you.
Yeah, so they can go to hamiltonforkansas.com. You can go there and you can sign up to volunteer. You can volunteer from any other part of the country. You can make phone calls from anywhere, send cards, all of that. So I need your volunteering help. If you know people in Kansas, please reach out to them. Just say, hey, I saw this guy, and with Jason Kander, and I think he'd be great. I mean, it's word of mouth. It's telling people that, especially if they live in Kansas. And then I need your financial support. I mean, we had a great first quarter. We're doing excellent. But we're just 1/5 of the way to what we're going to need to win in the general election. And so if you are out there and you say, I'm going to invest in another candidate someplace, even if you're not from Kansas, you say, this is about having another senator in the U.S. Senate that's going to help all of us, then I need your help. And you can donate from there as well. And here's what I say is on election night in November 3rd, you're going to be watching the TV. You're going to be seeing what people are going to be shocked. Like, man, look at this. Kansas is sending a Democrat to the United States Senate for the first time. And I want you to be able to sit there and say, and I helped make that happen. I was a part of this. And then whatever good we can do in the Senate, you'll know I was a part of making that happen. So I hope your listeners will join in and help and support our campaign, volunteering, telling their friends, and financially supporting.
Adam, you're getting really good at this. I'm excited.
Hey, Jason, thank you for having me on the program and also for mentoring me too. I really appreciated our lunch the other day, and your tips were really helpful for me.
Oh, well, I appreciate you saying that. It's fun to be able to help. So thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Have a great day. All right. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Please do support Adam. I think he's a great candidate, and I think he can win. I got through a solo one. These are not easy to do solo. I look forward to doing this with Ravi again. I think it'll be next week. Thanks for listening. You can follow me at Jason Kander everywhere. You can thank you to the Midas Mighty. You can give us a 5-star review wherever it is that you listen to this. And remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.